The 90s had a kind of thriller Hollywood barely makes anymore. Adult, mean, paranoid, morally broken. The kind of movie where nobody is safe, nobody is clean, and by the end, you're not even sure the movie wants justice. These aren't just dark thrillers. They feel like they slipped off the rails on purpose. So today, we're looking at 10 unhinged 90s thrillers that still feel dangerous. This is Picture Recall. Let's reopen the case. Number 10, To Die For, 1995. Before influencers, true crime celebrities, and people turning tragedy into content, To Die For had Suzanne Stone smiling into a camera like fame was a constitutional right. Gus Van Sant's film arrived in 1995, with Nicole Kidman giving what is still one of the most precisely calibrated comedic performances of the decade. A portrayal so committed to its own internal logic that it never tips into parody, even when it probably should. Suzanne Stone is a small-town woman with local television ambitions, a husband who doesn't share them, and a plan so staggeringly narcissistic and so utterly sincere that the film can never quite decide whether it wants to laugh at her or be terrified of her. It does both, simultaneously, for the entire runtime. The structure is a mock documentary. Interviews with family members, acquaintances, and the 3 teenagers Suzanne manipulates into murdering her husband, interspersed with the events themselves. There is no private Suzanne behind the public one. The performance has consumed the person entirely. What makes that portrait so genuinely disturbing is how recognizable it feels in 2026, when the entire economy of social media is built on exactly this collapse of self into image. What makes To Die For so disturbing isn't that Suzanne is lying. It's that she believes every word. But if Suzanne Stone turns ambition into murder, Wild Things turns manipulation into a sport. Number 9. Wild Things, 1998. Wild Things starts like a trashy erotic thriller and slowly reveals it's much smarter, meaner, and more ridiculous than it has any right to be. The setup is deliberately familiar. A high school guidance counselor in a wealthy Florida community is accused of rape by 2 students. The film appears to be building toward a conventional legal thriller resolution, and then, somewhere around the 40-minute mark, it simply detonates. The twist arrives. Then another twist. Then another. John McNaughton is doing something very specific here. Every revelation recontextualizes what came before it. Every character you thought you understood turns out to have been playing a role within the story's larger architecture. The Florida setting is not incidental. This is a world of wealth, class performance, and social pretension whose surfaces the film systematically strips away. The erotic thriller mechanics are the vehicle, not the destination. What Wild Things is actually about is how comprehensively people will deceive themselves and each other in service of money and survival. Wild Things doesn't lose the plot. It makes losing the plot part of the design. And somehow, Bridget Gregory makes everyone in Wild Things look almost sentimental. Number 8. The Last Seduction, 1994. The Last Seduction asks a simple question. What if the femme fatale didn't get punished because she was better at the game than everyone else? John Dahl's film begins mid-action. Bridget Gregory, played by Linda Fiorentino, steals a bag full of drug money from her husband, drives to a small upstate New York town, and begins constructing a new life out of whatever she finds there, which includes a local man named Mike, whom she identifies immediately as useful and proceeds to use. What is most striking about Dahl's approach is what he refuses to include: interiority, doubt, vulnerability, hesitation. We never see Bridget reconsider. We see her think, calculate, and act. And we see everyone around her underestimate her, which is the only mistake that matters. Linda Fiorentino's performance is one of the decade's least celebrated achievements. The role requires an actor who can be simultaneously compelling and completely without warmth. Fiorentino manages this entirely through intelligence. Bridget is not charming in any conventional sense. She is simply smarter than everyone in the room, and the film lets that be enough. It's not unhinged because Bridget loses control. It's unhinged because she never does. But not every unhinged 90s thriller is about control. Some are about what happens when control becomes impossible. Number 7. Fallen, 1998. Fallen takes the 90s serial killer thriller and quietly poisons it with something the genre can't arrest, interrogate, or understand. Denzel Washington plays Detective John Hobbs, who has just watched the execution of a serial killer he helped put away. A killer who, in his final moments, begins humming a song and touching the hands of everyone present. Shortly after, murders begin occurring that echo the dead man's methods. This is the language of a dozen films you have already seen, and the director deploys it deliberately, because the film needs you to believe you know what you're watching before it tells you what you're actually watching. The answer involves a demon that moves between human hosts through touch, that cannot be killed, that has been walking the earth for centuries. Fallen is not interested in ambiguity about whether the supernatural is real. It is real, it is ancient, and it is completely indifferent to the detective genre's promise that intelligence and persistence lead to resolution. What Denzel contributes cannot be overstated. His Hobbs approaches every problem as a detective problem, through evidence and logic. The film works because we believe in his competence absolutely, which means when that competence proves insufficient, the bottom drops out beneath the audience as well. Fallen works because Denzel plays the supernatural like a detective problem, until the movie proves it was never a detective problem at all. Number 6. A Simple Plan, 1998. A simple plan is what happens when ordinary people find life-changing money and immediately start proving they were never ordinary enough to survive it. Hank Mitchell, Bill Paxton, is a decent man in a small Minnesota town. He and his brother Jacob, Billy Bob Thornton, in an extraordinary performance, discover $4 million in a crashed plane buried in the snow. The money is almost certainly drug money. Nobody knows it's there. They keep it. What follows is a study in moral deterioration, as methodical as anything the decade produced. Each decision to protect the initial secret requires another decision that would have been unthinkable one scene earlier. Sam Raimi strips his visual style to near-complete austerity. Snow-covered landscape, gray light, flat Midwestern spaces. The film looks like the opposite of excess, and that visual sobriety is the argument. This is not a world of glamorous crime. It is a world of grocery stores, pickup trucks, and people making catastrophic choices in the register of small-town normalcy. Thornton's Jacob is the performance that anchors everything, the character who understands most clearly what keeping the money will cost, and who is simultaneously the least equipped to advocate for the right choice. The movie doesn't explode. It freezes over. And where A Simple Plan freezes the soul, Arlington Road sets paranoia loose in the suburbs. Number 5. Arlington Road, 1999. Arlington Road turns the friendly neighbor thriller into something nastier. What if the person next door isn't suspicious because he looks dangerous, but because he looks completely normal? Jeff Bridges plays Michael Faraday, a terrorism professor whose wife died in an FBI operation gone wrong. When his new neighbors, Tim Robbins and Joan Cusack, begin producing details that don't quite add up, he starts looking into them. The film is extraordinarily precise about the experience of well-founded suspicion in a social environment designed to make suspicion feel pathological. Every time Faraday brings his concerns to someone, the response is some version of, "You're obsessing because of your wife. You're seeing patterns that aren't there. Let this go." The ending refuses the conventional thriller's promise of individual agency, the hero's competence leading to resolution. Arlington Road argues, with considerable force, that some conspiracies are designed so that the person investigating them becomes the instrument of their completion. This is not a comfortable argument. The film does not apologize for making it. The most frightening thing in Arlington Road isn't the conspiracy, it's how normal the conspiracy looks. Number 4. The Devil's Advocate, 1997. The Devil's Advocate is not subtle, and thank God for that. Keanu Reeves plays Kevin Lomax, a Florida defense attorney with a perfect win record who accepts an offer to join a prestigious New York law firm run by John Milton, Al Pacino, without asking nearly enough questions about who John Milton actually is. The film is a Faustian bargain story so literal that the devil is eventually the devil. in a monologue that Pacino performs as though every word is a personal gift to the audience. Reeves is more interesting here than he usually gets credit for. Lomax's corruption is gradual, motivated, and comprehensible. A man who tells himself that winning is a tool for justice, who slowly stops checking whether justice is actually the outcome. Charlize Theron, as his wife who unravels under the supernatural pressure of the world she's entered, carries the film's emotional weight in ways the thriller mechanics occasionally obscure. The New York of this film, all dark marble, ludicrous penthouses, and moral vacancy, is a complete environment, a specific vision of wealth as infernal architecture. Some thrillers whisper temptation. The Devil's Advocate screams it from a penthouse. Number 3. One False Move, 1992. One False Move opens with violence so casual it almost feels wrong to keep watching. And that's exactly the point. Carl Franklin's film begins with a triple homicide executed by 3 people headed to a small Arkansas town for reasons that gradually reveal themselves to be more personal than criminal. 2 LAPD detectives follow the trail, where the local sheriff, Bill Paxton, is delighted by the prospect of action and almost completely unprepared for what's actually coming. Franklin has no interest in aestheticizing the violence his characters commit. People die because other people kill them, and the camera treats both facts with a directness that refuses the genre's usual mediation through style. What distinguishes the film is the density of its characterization. The connection between Fantasia, Cinda Williams, and the Arkansas town, which the film withholds until it can be most devastating, reframes the entire story as something other than a crime chase. It becomes a story about geography and identity, about the specific American experience of leaving a place and carrying it with you regardless. It's not trying to shock you with how violent people can be. It's showing how quickly violence becomes ordinary to the people who use it. Number 2. U-Turn, 1997. U-Turn might have the most overqualified cast ever assembled for a movie almost nobody saw. Sean Penn, Jennifer Lopez, Nick Nolte, Billy Bob Thornton, Joaquin Phoenix, Jon Voight, Powers Booth, Claire Danes. Every one of these people is in Oliver Stone's U-Turn, most of them playing characters so grotesque and so committed to their own specific form of depravity that the film achieves a community of vileness that is genuinely remarkable. Bobby Cooper, Sean Penn, is driving through Arizona with a debt problem and a car problem. The car breaks down in the small desert town of Superior, which is, in the film's vision, a kind of southwestern purgatory, a place of heat, corruption, and people who have been there too long and become whatever the desert makes people become. While waiting for his car to be repaired, Bobby gets involved with a woman, Jennifer Lopez, whose husband, Nick Nolte, approaches him separately with a proposition involving her murder. Stone shoots this in a visual register that matches the setting's derangement. Handheld cameras, extreme close-ups, desaturated colors, cuts that feel slightly too fast or slightly too slow. Robert Richardson's cinematography turns the Arizona landscape into something malevolent. The heat is not atmospheric texture. It is a character, pressing down on every scene with the weight of a place that wants you to make bad decisions. Joaquin Phoenix, playing a local kid who crosses Bobby's path, is doing something in this film that predicts exactly who he would become. U-Turn is what happens when a director stops trying to be reasonable and lets the whole movie sweat through its shirt. Number 1. Ravenous, 1999. Ravenous is a cannibal western, a war movie, a horror comedy, and somehow a thesis about America eating itself. Antonia Bird's film is set in a remote California military outpost in 1847 and follows Captain John Boyd, Guy Pearce, who arrives in disgrace after an act of cowardice that accidentally produced an act of heroism, the specific moral incoherence of which has left him unable to function. Into this environment arrives Robert Carlyle with a story about a stranded group and an act of cannibalism that may or may not be the entire truth. The film understands that cannibalism as metaphor only works if you follow it all the way. Ravenous is about manifest destiny, the American ideology of consumption as growth, of expansion as virtue, of taking as a form of becoming. The villain is not offering something aberrant. He is offering something that the political logic of the historical moment had already normalized, applied to human flesh rather than indigenous land. The Damon Albarn and Michael Nyman score is one of cinema's more genuinely strange sonic environments, a mix of percussion, fiddle, and orchestral elements that sounds like nothing else made in the decade. Ravenous doesn't feel like a movie that slipped through the cracks. It feels like the crack opened and this crawled out. Looking back, what makes these thrillers feel so alive isn't just the violence, the twists, or the bad decisions. It's the freedom. The freedom to be ugly, to be adult, to end badly, to let characters make choices that don't flatter the audience. The 90s didn't just make thrillers. They made thrillers that were willing to lose control. And that's why these still feel dangerous.